So good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. A pastor once said, everybody's testimony is the same. I was a jerk, but he saved me anyway. Everything else, it's details, right? So we've heard some wonderful testimonies as we've gone through these quarterly meetings. Most recently, we had the testimony of Mick. We had a testimony of Paul with Beth right at his side. I wish I had a testimony like that, but I don't. My testimony is more like the old gospel song, wasted years, oh, how foolish. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. You've heard me talk about my dad. You've heard me talk about my first pastor, but I will tell you about God's people. I was lost. I was married into a Southern Baptist family. And they welcomed this Yankee heathen and never said anything about me. They prayed me into God's kingdom. I walked into a Baptist church a few years later, lost, Yankee. It was a Southern Baptist church. And those people welcomed me and prayed me into God's kingdom. Then I walked into this Mennonite church. I was a Northern Baptist, and they prayed me into the fellowship. This is really a testimony about Jenny. The Bible says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Well, they missed a word in that verse. He who finds a good wife finds a good thing. Some people, I've heard this say, some people you're better off to be single, married, wishing you were married, than to be married, wishing you were single. But I will tell you, she is the personification of Proverbs chapter 31. There's another saying, I wish it were in the Bible, but it's not. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. And I've got a head full of knowledge, but zero common sense. She is endowed with both knowledge and wisdom. And every time I did not listen to her, I got in big trouble, not with her, but just in general. All right? Even as a lost man, she had a certain air about her that drew me to her. And she put up with me while I was lost. We'll go into the details later. She put up with me while I was lost. And she followed me and supported me through all my decisions, whether I was lost or whether I was saved. She was long-suffering, and she suffered a lot. She continues to suffer. I used to say, she hasn't thrown me out yet. And then she heard me say that, and she said, well, what good would it do? She's both long-suffering and patient. She's wiser than I am. She's smarter than I am. She's stronger than I am. She's got this is not saying much because I don't have any. She's got a higher tolerance for pain than I have. She is the glue that holds the family together. And in our family, and actually we've published within our family our own Skrabak dictionary of things that we say that nobody else knows. They typically come from things that kids say. Like my Rachel, she would call the television the bishi. All right. But there are some words that we use that you would understand. She's the beautifulest and the wonderfulest. Maybe scratch your head and say, well, why isn't she here? We'll get to the humble part shortly. Why isn't she here? Because she can't sit still. She can't sit through a half an hour television show if there was one worth watching. Right before, maybe 15 minutes before the pastor's done, she's done. She doesn't want to sit there anymore. She's thinking about something she can fix in front of the church, or she's thinking about something she could do for the family. She just can't sit still. And she's humble. And so if one word of this leaks out, you won't see her for about a month until everything blows over. Some of you are aware that my son John has a law degree. And he came to me about 2 weeks before graduation. He says, Dad, I have to tell you something. I said, what's that, John? He said, I don't want to be a lawyer. I said, that's great. Well, he was shocked because he thought I was going to throw a fit. I said, people spend half their lives trying to figure out what they don't want to be, or they, through experience, find out that they're not that thing. So you figured it out way early. So I want to tell you the things that I'm not. I'm not a Catholic, let alone a Catholic priest. I'm not a funeral director. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a mathematician. I used to be good at math, and then I got this thing called a calculator, went instant stupid. And then I got this smartphone. I used to have zillions of numbers in my head. If I lose that phone, I can't call anybody except my wife. I've got that phone number memorized. I'm not an evangelist. I'm not a pastor. I'm not an elder. I'm not a Mennonite, but I wish I was. And I'll give you the details of that later. My life is a life of Jekyll and Hyde. Before I was saved, it was drugs and alcohol and women. And so the pathway I want to lead you down, the Jekyll and Hyde, is a pathway of corporate and church and family. By church, I don't mean the local assembly. I'm talking about religion. Today, that thing is beginning to converge, and my life is now nothing but 3 B's: Bible, babies, and bees. I wake up every morning between 4:30 and 5, and I spend the next 4 to 5 hours in God's Word. I have 15 grandchildren, and I'm pleased to report that yesterday I became a great-grandfather. Now that has good news, bad news, good news, bad news that go along with it. The good news is I'm a great-grandfather. The bad news was that after 22 hours of labor, she had to have an emergency C-section. The good news is that mother and baby are fine, everybody's healthy, and nothing else counts. The bad news is that Jenny wrecked her car on the way to the hospital. The good news is that she's feeling fine. Everybody's healthy and nothing else counts. You can replace cars, but you can't replace bodies. I grew up in a small coal mining town. Now picture this: 5,000 people, 52 bars, and 13 churches for 5,000 people. So what kinds of people lived in a coal mining town that supported 52 bars and 13 churches? You probably didn't know this statistic. At its height, 100,000 coal miners died every year. My dad was a funeral director, and so his business thrived. He supported the Catholic clientele, so I was surrounded by Catholicism and in a town where people felt life was short, so they lived it, in their minds, to the fullest. Well, I had no clue what it meant to live life to the fullest until I met Jesus Christ. My dad told us in the earliest of years, he said, I don't want you to be a funeral director. I want you to go out and get the best education you can afford, and then go to work for the largest company that'll hire you, and your future will be secured. So I got an education at one of the finest universities in the country. I went to work for the largest company in the world, and I got laid off. And so with that as the early directive, I decided I wanted to be a Catholic priest. I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, Catholic seminary, but not yet saved. I was a good kid. I was an Eagle Scout. I was the local lifeguard. But when I shifted from seminary to a secular college, the pendulum also shifted. And so Goody Two Shoes became Mr. Trouble. I studied mathematics and then got introduced to computer science. Now, how valuable is a 1973 degree in computer science? It was punched cards, but that's neither here nor there. I got out of school and I started climbing the corporate ladder. I was one of the first CIOs under 30 years old ever. But there was Jekyll and Hyde. By day, I was Mr. Corporate. By then, we wore three-piece suits, remember the vests and the wide ties. But by night, I was a jerk. Then I met Jenny. I hired her. And I tell folks, she worked for me, then we got married, and I spent the rest of my life working for her. The fact of the matter is, she has slaved for me and for our family. She's the best. She takes me down to West Virginia a month before we get married. And talk about the bowels of West Virginia. I didn't understand a word any of those people said. And after about a half an hour, I didn't understand her either. Well, if they talked about me, they didn't talk about me to my face. They were praying people, and they welcomed me into the family. I met my first Mennonites when Jenny was pregnant with our first child. I was going to school at night at Drexel, so she had to go to child labor class by herself. So what's the assumption people make? Single mother to be. And this couple loved on her. And then I showed up the next week, and that took all the magic out of it. But we started school, we started the family, and I said, now look, no kids and no houses till I finish my MBA. Well, 2 kids and 2 houses later, I graduated. I always had a passion for houses and cars and motorcycles and boats and horses, all those toys. And that first toy, the notion of a house, leads me to salvation. Because we're living in Parksburg, and we found this house that was actually a Victorian mansion between Parksburg and Eklund. And I signed up for it. And then I realized I didn't have the cash for the down payment. So I'm working full-time at Lucan's. I'm finishing up my classes in Drexel, and I'm teaching 2 nights a week at Millersville University to try to come up with the cash, which we did. Well, on December 26, 1978, Jenny says, I've had enough of your foolishness. I'm out of here. So she picks up our 2 kids at the time, 3 years old, 2 years old, and disappears. And I'm stuck in this Victorian house. Well, I turned it into a party house. What I didn't know was she spent 6 months over at the Nottingham Missionary Baptist Church. And even though the pastor didn't call her out, she came under the conviction that her place was with her husband, no matter what kind of a jerk he is. And we went through custody, and it was violent, and the state police were involved. And one day she comes driving up the driveway, and she says, I'm home. By that point, my corporate heir, I won the house, I won the custody, I won everything. And I'm thinking, what is she trying to do? Mess up these arrangements? So I called my boss. I said, look, she came home. I'm taking a week of vacation. They call it PTO these days. And we're going through this week of trying to get back together. And she says, I think we ought to go to church. Keep in mind, I had plenty of theology and plenty of church in my background, but I wanted the family and I wanted those little girls. And I said, okay. And we get introduced to the Eklund Missionary Baptist Church. And there was a Tiny Tots Sunday school teacher there. Her name was Kitty Alaband, mother of Wilma Wyatt. And Kitty Alaban showed those little kids so much love that the family started gelling back together. Okay, what harm can they do to my Catholic theology when she's talking about Noah and Abraham and Samson and all those kinds of things? All right. But what it didn't know was she was praying me into God's kingdom. So we cycle through a year, and now we're up around Christmas time again. By this point, I'm carrying my Catholic Bible, and I show up about once every other week. And the pastor starts reading in Luke chapter 1. And you know, my first daughter's name is Elizabeth, and I decided that pastor was dumber than a fence post. He didn't know anything. In fact, didn't even have a good grammar. But he hits Elizabeth, and I've got my Bible open, and I'm keep in mind Catholics don't read Bibles as a general rule. I see the name Elizabeth, the wife of Zechariah, and I said, oh, this is pretty interesting. I think I'll read about Elizabeth. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So I jumped from Elizabeth, and now you come into John the Baptist. And now I'm getting really interested. And I ran into this verse. And he shall be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. And he should be filled with the Holy Ghost, even from his mother's womb. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. And here's my salvation verse and my life verse. And he shall go forth with the spirit and the power of Elijah, and shall return the love of the fathers back to their children. And I thought about how I used those two little girls as political footballs in the court systems. I thought about what I had done to those two little girls by not being home at night when I should have been. And I knew right then and there that if that chandelier fell on me, I was going to die and go to hell. And I simply said, Jesus, please save me. And he did. That church would always sing just as I am, but I didn't wait. The second half of that verse continues on. To make ready a people prepared for the Lord. That goes hand in hand with Colossians 1:28. Paul says this, him, Christ, we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom. Now, I don't have any wisdom, but God did bless me with a way of connecting different Bible verses, and that's where the wisdom comes in, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. So my life verse deals with returning the love of fathers back to their children, and teaching and warning that we'd all be prepared when Jesus Christ comes back. Well, the next day I go to work. I said, guys, guess what? I got saved. They said, oh, no. I said, what do you mean, oh, no? So you won't go to lunch with us anymore. You won't be telling us any more of those great jokes anymore. I said, no. This salvation stuff, it's really cool. Well, it didn't take long. I wasn't going to lunch with them anymore. I not only didn't tell those kinds of jokes, I did not find them funny. And I started taking 3x5 index cards. I had a lot of catching up to do. I went to Kmart, whoever was in business at the time, and I bought 2 paperback Bibles, 99 cents each. And if the verse I wanted to memorize was on the even page, I cut it out of this Bible. If it was on the odd page, I cut it out of this Bible, and I pasted them on 3x5 cards with the reference on the back side, and I drive to and from work going like this. And God still let me live. And through that process, I've memorized several books of the Bible. Well, since that time, my brain is shrinking. I'll take the one example, the book of James. If somebody said, quote something from James, I would talk about swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. But if you asked me to give you the rest of the verse, I'd have to go to Google. I first realized that my mind was starting to disappear. Rosie, you were there. Before COVID, we had vacation Bible school in the evenings, and I taught an adult class. And there sat Rosie, and there sat Jim, And I could not quote from Romans, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart, thou shalt be saved. I knew it was Romans 10:9, but I had no clue what the verse was. And so I'll continue to teach until I start babbling, then you can just throw me out. We'll come to that too. So I told the guys I couldn't go to lunch. I started a Bible study at lunch hour in the conference room. I get a phone call from my boss who said, I understand you have a Bible study. I said, yeah. I didn't realize his motivation. I says, it's a Wednesdays at lunch hour. You're more than welcome to come. He said, do you have control of your actions? 1 month later, I was laid off. I had worked at Lucan's, and that chemistry was very special. I worked for Exxon Office Systems. That was mechanical assembly. So I had a 3-ring trump card: computer science, supply chain, and steel. So I get invited down to Texas to interview. First, they invited me to Pittsburgh, the home of steel, right? Had an interview there. They said, you're perfect. Come to Texas, bring your wife, stay a few days, and we'll continue the interview. So I go down to Texas. They take me through Longview, Texas, tour the steel company, talk to the CEO, talk to all the C officers. And they take Jenny and they connect her with the Chamber of Commerce. Real estate, loans, all those kinds of things. And at the end of the 3 days, the guy says, so what do you think? I said, this is wonderful. I'm ready to go. I know where my church is going to be. I know where my house is going to be. I know where the school is going to be. He said, let me guess. You're going to move into that school district. I said, I never heard of that school district. He said, you're going to go to that church. I said, I drove past that church, but it was a mega church. They had like TV satellites outside and everything else. I said, that's not where I would feel comfortable. He said, I live right behind that church. I said, really? He said, yeah, what bothers me is they've got these lights in the parking lot that shine into my bedroom and I really can't sleep. I said, I talked with somebody, they're wonderful people. They'd be glad to adjust the lights. He said, that's not really what bothers me. I said, what bothers you? He said, the people coming knocking on my doors and sticking stuff in the mailbox. I said, you mean like this? And out came a gospel tract. Well, that was the end of the interview, and that was the end of the job opportunity. I had a man working for me and had the same kind of trump card, and they invited him down for an interview. Wife and 8 kids. I said to him, this is what happened to me, so you can do whatever you want. He goes down, goes to the interview, never mentions Jesus Christ, gets hired, and a month later, he and his 8 kids are sitting down there in Texas, laid off. So during that layoff process, I relocated. The first job I could find is Anne Arundel County. That's between Baltimore and D.C. So we sell out the mansion between Parksburg and Ackland, and we move down there, and I find this great Baptist church. And then I discovered this thing called legalism. It was a legalistic church, and before I realized it, I was a legalist. But at that church, I met this wonderful, wonderful man. His name is Jerry Zengler. He's got more evangelism in his little finger than I have in my whole body. And one day I was over at his house and he gets a phone call. There was this lady dying of cancer. Can you please go and visit? I said, well, let's go. So we both went to visit. We go and we knock on the door. It was a very light rain. Nobody home. So we're looking at each other saying, what is happening here? We turn and we're surrounded by 6 guys. He says, you take 3, I'll take 3. Well, I thought I was ready to get beat up. He pulls out his Bible. He leads those 3 to Jesus Christ, and I'm fumbling over the Romans road. He comes over and leads my 3 to Jesus Christ. I knew right then and there I did not have the gift of evangelism, but I do share God's word. So we moved back up to Cochranville, but I still worked at Jessup, Maryland, which is halfway between Baltimore and DC. The second tunnel hadn't been built yet, so I had plenty of time with my 3x5 index cards. When I moved back, they made me the assistant pastor of Ackland Missionary Baptist Church. And we started a home Bible study. Started in the Cochranville Fire Hall. And Rachel Craig, when she was a little girl, would come. We would do Sunday school down in the basement. I'm sure based on the age of that building, it was just asbestos pipes and everything else, but she's lived to tell about it. Well, I've got a lot of reasons that I could use, but I will call this a breach of faith. Those people, that thing grew well over 100 people. Those people needed a full-time pastor. And none of them had 2 nickels to rub together. So I said, how am I going to support this family? So rather than stepping out on faith, I found another pastor, a good friend of mine. And that's when I woke up to legalism, because he was really, really deep into the legalism. I tried my best to steer the church in some proper direction, even though I was also guilty of legalism. The church still survives. It's the community. It's a Safe Harbor Baptist Church in Cochranville. So I went from assistant pastor to nomad. I realized I wasn't an evangelist. I wasn't a pastor. So I became a nomad searching for a church. And I've told many people this. I said, if you're looking for a church, don't go to Sunday school. Because if the Sunday, with a family, because if the Sunday school teachers are doing the job, they're going to say to the kids, hope to see you next Sunday. And the kids might be their classmates at school, and they're going to say, I hope to see you on Sunday. And they're just basically ripping the kid's heart out week after week. So I found Mount Vernon. We homeschooled our kids for many years. John Paul gets born. All of our kids had bilirubin problems. His was so bad we had to go back to the hospital. Now we're in the hospital and the doctor says, you're going to be discharged from this bilirubin thing, but we want you to go straight to a pediatric cardiologist because your kid's got a hole in his heart. So we had to go to Harrisburg, first guy we could find. And ultrasound today is wonderful. I saw those great ultrasounds of the great-granddaughter. Well, back then it was just black and white dots and things going back and forth and back and forth. He said, that is your son's heart. And the dots going back and forth is his blood as opposed to going through the body. It's just sloshing around inside of his heart. So take him home. If his heart starts to fail, we'll do surgery. See you again in 2 weeks. Well, he didn't tell us that the heart failure for a baby is not like an adult where you get the heart attack and you fall over. It's slow but sure, and the fingers turn blue and whatever. So here's Jenny and myself trying to homeschool, trying to pay attention to this kid. The 2 weeks go back, and I go back to this little Jewish doctor, heavy German accent. He said, that's just amazing. I said, what's amazing? He said, there's no hole in his heart. I don't understand that. I said, well, I can explain that. That's Jesus Christ. And so we gave up on homeschool because we thought if we missed something that's going on here, and that's where we got introduced to West Fallowfield Christian School. And at West Fallowfield Christian School, there was a young man in Elizabeth's class named John Myers, son of Vernon Myers. And so we had to try out this church, okay? Well, I've asked a couple of people how I transitioned from visitor to Sunday school teacher, and nobody could give me the answer. They said, you've always been a Sunday school teacher, so if you happen to remember, just please let me know. It's a really big item of curiosity for me. So I'm landing in a Mount Vernon church, and I'm still a corporate bigwig. I have hired good Christians. I have hired bad Christians. I took my excess cash and put it into real estate rentals. And I have rented to good Christians, and I have rented to bad Christians. And I have fired and evicted a whole lot of bad Christians. I got weighed down with all of the problems that these people had. One man came to me, coincidentally, he was also the father of 8. He said, John, can we go to lunch? I said, sure, let's go to lunch. He tells me that his youngest, who was 2 years old, was dying of brain cancer. He told me that his wife regressed into childhood and moved back in with her mom and dad. So here's this guy, single parent, 8 kids, one's 2 years old and dying of cancer. And I lead this guy to Jesus Christ over lunch. He comes back to me a week later. He says, John, how do I know that I'm saved? I said, let me ask you a question. Do you notice all the pretty women in the office? He said, yeah, it's killing me. I said, you're saved. Company ownership shifted. And here's where my pride comes in. Company ownership shifted, and I now became no longer the CIO, but somebody reporting to a CIO, Chief Information Officer, head IT guy. I had a worldwide network with at least one factory on every continent. And his idea of IT was to keep the local area network going. I said, I can't work for this guy. So I took a job as a consultant, and I worked in 8 different sales territories. And I realized, okay, I don't want to be a manager anymore. I don't want to have all those people's problems on my brain. And I don't want to be a slave to 8 people's calendars. What am I going to do? Boss comes to me and said, would you like to be in sales? And I want you to know I hate salespeople. I still hate salespeople. He's retired. He's okay now. And I said, I'll take the job. He said, what do you mean you'll take the job? I didn't tell you about the comp plan. I didn't tell you about the territory. I said, look, your win is my win. I'll take the job. What I didn't tell him was I had a premonition that I was going to be #1 in the world that year. And I was going to have an opportunity to tell people about Jesus Christ. So fast forward 1 year, rookie in sales, not one day of training, I become #1 sales rep in the world. And what they do with salespeople that beat their quota, they send them off to some fancy island. They have a trip and whatever. So we're off at this island. And I'm getting all dressed up to go to the big shindig, and the phone rings. He said, John, last year's award ceremony went long, and the air conditioning here is not quite up to snuff. So we don't even want you to come to the head table. Just stand up, be recognized, and sit down. By the time I hung up that phone, I had the premonition I was going to be #1 in the world again. And I'd have an opportunity to tell people about Jesus Christ. Fast forward another year, and I'm #1 in the world. And I get a phone call about a month before the big trip. And the boss says, you know, the IRS has changed its rules, and we have to have a business agenda, or we don't have the opportunity of writing off this trip. So I want you to take 20 minutes and explain the secret to your success. So I had my stopwatch going. I took 19 minutes to explain all the things they wanted to hear, you know, about my wonderful consultant and the wonderful product and the wonderful company. But every one of those bullets got tied back to the last minute, which was all about Jesus Christ. And I made some friends and I made some foes, and the foes who were in charge made sure I was never going to be #1 in the world again. The second set of Mennonites I met of note were a pair of brothers, Bill and Ivan Umble. You know the Umble family? Okay. They were builders. They built our house. I told you I had a passion for houses, right? Jenny designed our house. And we would visit it every day as they dug the hole and did the cinder block and do this. Well, I go in there one day. They're now putting up the framing of the second floor. And that hallway looks, to me, it was narrow. I pull out my tape measure, and sure enough, it was 6 inches narrower than the plan. So I talked to Bill. I said, that hallway is narrow. He said, that's standard. I said, this is not a standard house. The reason I wanted a wider hallway is, first of all, I didn't want to think I was walking down a tunnel. And second of all, I wanted to hang all my kids' pictures on the side and not worry about my shoulders hitting them. I go back the next day, and without a word, they moved the whole wall. Now they're putting in whatever they're called, the things that over your bathroom, and they have the light bulbs up inside of them. I said, that thing doesn't look right. He said, what do you think it should be? I said, it should be in about 4 inches. I go back the next day and it's in 4 inches. I look at it again. I said, you were right. Now I'll go back the next day and it was back where it was originally. He was showing me something that I had never seen in that little coal mining town. So somewhere along the line, I get elected to church council. Remember when we had elders and counselors? And the very first agenda item, Rick Conrad says, I don't think we need 2 church governing bodies. And I'm sitting there thinking, new kid on the block thinking, there are only a couple hundred people here. What do you need 2 bodies for? So as soon as he said that, he said, I make a motion to collapse one of them. Well, I thought it was going to happen that day. It took about 8 months to go through the details of getting rid of that one thing. So I talked myself out of a job. I was no longer on the church council. I was teaching Sunday school in the sanctuary, and one of the church leaders, I don't know if he came to me as an individual or if he came to me at the command of the rest of the leaders, they said, we don't want you teaching anymore on eternal security. I said, I'm taught to teach the whole counsel of God, and that's what I'm going to teach. Well, in the meantime, I get a phone call from State Line Baptist Church. They needed some help. So I said, okay, don't want to hear about eternal security? I'll go over there for a while. Run into Wilma Wyatt again. Somehow I came back to this church. I can't remember the details. And I became an elder. And we did some good things as elders. One of the things was we got our church away from MCUSA when that denomination lost its way. But also we did some ugly things, and this church shrank from about 300 people down to 100 people. And I had an opportunity one evening to go deal with some church discipline. So the pastor and I go and we're dealing with this church discipline. Keep in mind at that point, my house is about 5 years old. I get a phone call from Jenny. She says, you better come home. The house is on fire. I get home. The fire was put out, and it was the electrical work, not knob and tube antique. It was brand new electrical work, and no one ever could understand why it went on fire. So I can tell you why it went on fire. Because that church discipline was uncalled for. That was my great awakening. And I realized that this church was going down the wrong path. We fixed the problem. I'm no longer an elder. I don't think I'm elder material because my brain is shrinking. So I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and be a good cheerleader, okay? Something else happened at this church. One day, my Leah and her best friend were out looking for worms to go fishing. And our horse comes skipping by. It was the first pretty day in spring, and the horse flicks out one of its feet and blows a 3-inch diameter hole in the side of Leah's head. I'll fast forward that aren't aware. It's a Cinderella ending. She sits with me. She's got 6 kids. It's a beautiful thing. But she got helicoptered out to CHOP. I called up Bernie. I said, Bernie, I don't think I can teach Sunday school tomorrow because my daughter just got helicoptered out to CHOP. He said, you're kidding. I wish he were here so he would go like this. I said, I'm not kidding. Well, surgery was about 10 hours, and they didn't know if she was going to live. The doctor came out and he said, She's going to be legally blind and deaf in one ear. I said, what does legally blind mean? He said, I can hold my fingers like this and she can count them. When I put my fingers shoulder width, she can't see my hands. But she will live. She spent 10 days in intensive care. And then we went down to AI DuPont for children. And this church did the most wonderful thing. They put together this box of little gifts. They called it a sunshine box. And every day she got to open one of them. And it was her motivation to go another day, another day, another day. And at DuPont, if you have the situation like Leah did, every week she gets a complete physical examination. And I spent a lot of time down there. And there was this room with walls about this thick. And the doctor, and it was a university hospital, so he was calling all these medical students over saying, this is remarkable, this is remarkable. I get in line, I said, I'm the dad, what's so remarkable? He said, she has perfect hearing and we don't know why. I said, well, I can tell you why, it's Jesus Christ. They did not put a plate on her head right away because the accident happened in a barnyard and they were afraid the manure might cause some infection. So they just stitched her shut and she just had that 3-inch diameter hole. That went for 3 months. We go back to the hospital. I said, Doc, I need to tell you something. She's got perfect hearing and they don't know why. And the way they explained, you got the stirrup and all those other bones in the middle. There was nothing that it was connected to. They don't know why they were vibrating. I said, they don't know why, so don't mess it up. He said, no problem. We'll take that tiny titanium plate and just grind a little bit off, and it'll be just fine. There'll be this little slice that if one of her brothers hits her right there, she's dead. But over time, that'll grow shut. We had a follow-up, and he said, her recovery is just amazing. I said, it's Jesus Christ. And then the man confessed to me, he was Chinese. He said, I'm not only Chinese, I'm a communist and I'm an atheist. He said, but I've realized that praying people recover faster than anybody else. I don't know if he was in a residency or what he was doing, but the man moved back to China and I lost touch with him. I hope he's found Jesus Christ. But once again, God's people and their prayers hit the mark. Another one of my daughters, on the night that she was 21 years old, this is Rachel. What she did when she graduated, she said, I want to give a year to Habitat for Humanity. And so I've talked to them and I have 2 opportunities. One's in Dallas and one's in Baltimore. Which one do you think I should pick, Dad? I said, well, I don't know a whole lot about either city, but I'll tell you what. If you're in Dallas and you need me, it's get a plane ride, get to the airport, get a rental car, get to you. It could cost me half a day, if not more. If you're in Baltimore, I can be there in just over an hour. She picked Baltimore. On top of that, she was a saver. We call her a money monger. She bought an old beat up house and her plan was to rehab it and at the end of the year, give it to Habitat for Humanity for other people to move in. So she moved in tools and she moved things like fans and whatever. And that particular night, she calls me and she says, Dad, I am super tired. Why don't I just stay here? I said, I don't think that's a great idea. She said, oh, Dad. I said, okay. Well, what happened that night, it was August, it was hot. She locked up the house, had the second floor windows unlocked to get some air coming through. Some guy took a piece of iron fence, turned it sideways into a ladder, climbed up those steps, climbed down the flight of steps, and raped her. I get a phone call about 5 in the morning. He left her tied up and gagged, and she somehow, over the hours, broke through all that, got to the next door neighbor. They got her to the hospital. I get a phone call from the police. You better come down here. Your daughter's been raped. So Jenny and I jump in the car. We go down to the hospital, and there she is, bruises all over her body, rope marks, tape marks, all kinds of other things. And Jenny passes out. So I have two people in the emergency room. And my prayer was, oh God, oh God. I didn't know how else to pray. That has a Cinderella ending as well. It took her 10 years to even come close to a guy. I couldn't even touch her because she would go like this. She ended up marrying her childhood sweetheart, fourth grade Sunday school that she met right here. And so Cinderella ending, beautiful kids, beautiful family. So we've had some dark days, and I mentioned the Great Awakening. And I will tell you, I have met some wonderful role models in this church. A lot of them have since gone on. And I've learned a lot from you role models. But the one instance where everything just got cooked right into about 45 minutes, I was sitting in the funeral service of Lester Keener. Who knows Lester Keener? Okay. Unassuming, little bow tie. If you ever said anything other than hi, I don't remember it. And they go through the testimonies of this man. And I'm sitting there saying, that's not me. And that's not me. And that's not me. And the tears started to flow. And I said, God, I want to be a Lester Keener. And I'm not. And that's where I said in the opening comments, I'm not a Mennonite, but I wish I were. If I could pick one guy that I could be like, it would be Lester Keener.